Hayao Miyazaki is widely considered to be the most influential anime artist of all time, and one of the most accomplished filmmakers in the history of animation. Having co-founded the well-known and beloved anime studio, Studio Ghibli, with Isao Takahata in 1985, he would go on to create some of the highest-grossing and most critically acclaimed anime movies ever made, like Princess Mononoke in 1997 and Spirited Away in 2001. In 1984, Miyazaki wrote and directed Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind, which released in Japanese cinemas to critical acclaim. The movie represents a highly influential moment in the history of anime, since its success led to the founding of Studio Ghibli. Although Nausicaä is not Miyazaki's directorial debut, it is the first of his original artistic properties to be brought to the big screen. It's based on a manga of the same name that Miyazaki began serializing in 1982, 3 years prior to the movie's release, and continued to work on for nearly a decade, finishing in 1994. The series has maintained a global cult following since its release, and has even been described as Miyazaki's magnus opus, due to its epic scope, spanning 7 volumes and over 1,000 pages. It's important we understand the meaning behind Nausicaä, given Miyazaki's immense influence on anime and the foundational role Nausicaä played in his career. Many analysts have highlighted an anti-violence sentiment running throughout Nausicaä. The story takes place in a post-apocalyptic wasteland ravaged by nuclear war, while the protagonist, Princess Nausicaä, hates violence and attempts to prevent a future war between two kingdoms. At the same time, Nausicaä is deeply fascinated by the toxic jungle, a novel but poisonous ecosystem that has grown from the pollution of the old world, which is now caught in the crossfire of the warring nations. In the movie, Nausicaä discovers that when the jungle grows, it eventually cleanses itself of pollution and turns into a stone forest, which can restore the earth and make it habitable to people once more. As a result, most analysts have come to interpret Nausicaä through a traditional environmentalist lens, where nature, as represented by the forest, is a fragile and benevolent life support system that will restore the earth if it can be protected from destructive humans. Although this interpretation is an accurate reading of the movie, it leaves me feeling unsatisfied, since it contradicts Miyazaki's belief that nature has an antagonistic quality and does not require human protection to survive. It also leaves fascinating elements of the movie unaddressed, like how the toxic jungle can represent nature when it is in part a product of human pollution. Quote, "Isn't it the height of arrogance to keep showing nature as needing protection to keep it from disappearing? This is what I don't care for. Everyone depicts nature as being charming, but it is something more fearsome. That is why I think there is something missing in our current view of nature." End quote. The manga covers the plot of the movie in its first 2 volumes, and then expands far beyond it. In this expansion, Miyazaki builds significantly on the world and characters of the movie. The work therefore provides a wealth of analytical content for determining Nausicaa's overall meaning. However, few analysts make their interpretations with any reference to the manga, meaning that the majority of the Nausicaä story remains analytically unexplored. Those few that do reference the manga often do so without any detailed analysis of the plot or character development arcs, preferring to make broad stroke impressions that try to capture the feeling of the work. Finally, a veritable bounty of insight into Miyazaki's art, philosophy, and creative process exists in the form of interviews compiled over 30 years in the books Starting Point and Turning Point. However, like the manga, these resources remain largely unexplored, meaning that analysts are unable to directly substantiate many of the claims they make regarding Miyazaki's beliefs. In this video, I want to determine the true meaning of Nausicaä by conducting a detailed reanalysis of both the anime and manga with reference to Starting Point and Turning Point. And I want to follow this up with a reinterpretation of the Nausicaä franchise that takes into account the findings of this new analysis, a review of major character developments, and an interpretation of Miyazaki's motivations and beliefs while he was creating Nausicaä. Chapter 2. Plot Summary. Nausicaä takes place 1,000 years after the 7 Days of Fire, a nuclear war that devastated the globe. Earth is now a wasteland, and humanity has been reduced to small feudal kingdoms and warring city-states that fight for the last remnants of habitable land. Giant fungi and insects have replaced the familiar life forms of the old world, working in symbiosis to spread deadly poison spores across the wasteland. The toxic jungle expands and chokes out the last few communities, while the warring nations enrage the forest with their machines and gunfire, making the forest spread even faster. The movie begins with Nausicaa's kingdom, the peaceful Valley of the Wind, being invaded by the far larger military nation of Tolmekia, led by the warrior princess Kushana and her second-in-command Kurotawa. Kushana plans to destroy the toxic jungle using a god warrior, one of the gigantic anthropomorphic bioweapons that caused the 7 Days of Fire. Kushana's troops execute Nausicaa's father, leading Nausicaa to kill several of the soldiers in a blind rage. Later, the wise master Yupa discovers that Nausicaa has been cultivating fungi from the toxic jungle in a secret garden underneath the castle. She has found a way to purify the fungi of their poisons by growing them away from the pollution in pristine soil and water from the valley. Nausicaa is ashamed of her violent actions and is terrified of the anger within her. Knowing that she will soon be taken by Kushana as a political prisoner, Nausicaa turns off the supply of water to her garden, killing the carefully cultivated fungi. Nausicaa then crash lands in the toxic jungle and meets the Ohm, giant sentient insects who show her a childhood memory from when she tried to save a baby Ohm from being put down by her father. Afterwards, Nausicaa falls deep beneath the roots of the toxic jungle, finding herself in an ancient part of the forest that has turned to stone. This petrified forest is purifying the world of pollution, as the trees absorb the earth's poison, turn to stone, and then erode into purified soil. In the finale, Tolmekia's enemy, the Pegite state, uses an injured baby Ohm to bait thousands of enraged Ohm into the valley, where Kushana's army is held up. Kushana activates the God Warrior, which unleashes several nuclear blasts onto the Ohm, but disintegrates soon after, having been awoken from its embryonic sleep too soon. Nausicaa tries desperately to save the baby, to quell the Ohm's rage, but she is killed in the stampede. Having realized their mistake, the Ohm resurrect Nausicaa and return to the jungle. Kushana leaves the valley, having been humbled by Nausicaa's self-sacrifice, and we then see Nausicaa and her people digging a well to harness the pure water from underground. Finally, we see a single green sapling growing deep in the petrified forest, signaling a return to a cleansed environment where humans will live sustainably and peacefully with nature. The manga, for the most part, covers the events of the anime and then continues onwards. Soon after the Ohm Stampede, we are introduced to the Doric Principalities, a theocracy ruled over by the Holy Emperor Miraloopa and his brother Namalif. As the Doric expand, they use religion to suppress native faiths and control the minds of the people. Nausicaa gets embroiled in this war, rescuing as many civilians as she can, which gains her a reputation as being a long-prophesied liberator of the people. Miraloopa has access to the crypt, a huge cache of old-world technology and knowledge, governed over by an AI called the Crypt Keeper. Doric scientists use this technology to make an advanced bioweapon, the Giant Mold, a huge toxic fungus which the Doric plan to unleash on Tolmekian land. The mold begins to engulf everything in its path, enraged in its knowledge that it was designed as a weapon. It is eventually pacified by the Ohm, who sacrifice themselves in order to calm the mold, which in turn births a new toxic forest. In a moment of suicidal weakness, Nausicaa tries to sacrifice herself alongside the Ohm and allows herself to be engulfed by the fungus, but the Ohm protect her. When Nausicaa emerges from the new fungal growth, she is crowned God of the Forest by the Worm Handlers, a scavenger people who live alongside the jungle. Together they form an army for Nausicaa, which she then uses to fight the Crypt Keeper. The manga is expansive, covering numerous battles and revelations, and so, for the sake of brevity, I'm only going to cover the most relevant events here. Nausicaa meets the Forest People, a group of tribal nomads who live within the toxic jungle. They show Nausicaa the forest within her own psyche, and lead her to the heart of the real jungle, the oldest part of the petrified forest, where the ancient stone trees have finished purifying the land, revealing a precious Eden. Nausicaa goes on to discover that the petrified forest was actually designed by ecologists before the 7 days of fire to purify the world and make it habitable once again if it was ever destroyed by nuclear war. However, the people of the wasteland have also come to be polluted by the toxic jungle spores, and they will not be able to survive in the clean air of the purified world. Nausicaa eventually storms the crypt and confronts the crypt keeper. The keeper is guarding a race of genetically advanced human embryos, waiting to be born into the purified world. Nausicaa boldly proclaims that the crypt is an affront to life itself, corrupted in its attempt to dominate life for the sake of some misguided sense of purity. She destroys the keeper, and with it all the embryos and advanced technology stored within. Section 3. Analysis. Part 1. Environmentalism and the forest. Although the stone forest can purify the earth over the course of hundreds of years, Miyazaki's nature is a far cry from being the entirely benevolent force that previous analysts have claimed it to be. The jungle is a hostile wilderness, an environment that is near totally uninhabitable to humans due to the toxic fungal spores that fill the air. Human interference accelerates the spread of the toxic jungle, with gunshots and destruction angering the forest insects, causing stampedes. However, the jungle still encroaches ceaselessly upon the last remaining habitable spaces, with or without the human interference, swallowing up innocents and leaving ruin in its wake. Even the people of the Valley of the Wind, who respect the jungle, still all inevitably succumb to the fatal stone paralysis disease, which results from proximal exposure to the forest spores. Miyazaki wants us to know that the environment has a dark side. Quote, "It is not enough to just go around saying how wonderful nature is. We also need to explain what sort of inconveniences and even harm nature can bring to us." End quote. The jungle isn't just dangerous, it's also very alien, being devoid of all the familiar animals and plants from the old world. In their place are insects and fungi, forms that are completely estranged from humans and are commonly associated with disgust, fear, and decay. In Miyazaki's own words, quote, "I wanted this form to resist empathy. There are many people who don't like bugs, so I thought bugs were just right to express a contrasting ecosystem." End quote. However, to say that the toxic jungle is just a hostile wilderness is as simplistic as when the environmentalists call it a benevolent Mother Earth. When we follow in the footsteps of someone who treads lightly through the forest, like Nausicaä, we see that the dangerous toxic jungle can be a sublime space, full of mystery and wonder, igniting both artistic and scientific curiosity. Quote, "I think anyone who has collected insects as a child had the experience of looking at the bumps on a cicada's head and wondering why its shape is so interesting. The wonder one experiences in that moment is extraordinary. These are among the first awesome things children encounter. We feel like we peeked into some of the secrets of the world." End quote. There are also tangible resources to be found in the jungle, as long as you tread carefully. The worm handlers and forest people make a living gathering parts from the forest, and at the beginning of the story we see Nausicaa salvaging a shedded omi from the jungle to use as a viewing screen in the valley's gunship. We are therefore left with a view of the toxic jungle that is neither entirely good nor bad, but a mix that may appear more or less good depending on who's viewing it. Quote, "We see birds that harm humans as harmful, and those that are useful to humans as useful. It's all arbitrary. The impression we have of a landscape changes depending on the emotions of the person viewing the landscape. Nature that is generous is, at the same time, nature that is ferocious. This is why humans feel humbled in the face of nature, and why they are able to realize its true abundance." End quote. Depending on the viewer's emotion, they may see the jungle as a benevolent ecosystem that offers up beauty and resources, and at other times they may see its dark side, which emanates human suffering and suffocation. The fact that the jungle can be viewed under these different lenses and elicits such a range of emotions is testament to the fact that it is not a mere placeholder for Mother Nature's purity and goodness. Nor is the toxic jungle entirely natural, at least in the classic environmentalist sense, that is to say free of the influences of humans, since it is either A, the result of human pollution, as in the film, or B, a genetically engineered ecosystem, designed by ecologists to purify the world of pollution, as in the manga. The jungle is as much a product of humans as it is natural evolution, making it an anthropogenic ecosystem. Nausicaa does not revere a pristine environment, but the exact opposite, a corrupted and wild environment, where the interactions of nature and humans have coalesced to create something new. When Nausicaa discovers the ancient stone forest, she sees a pristine ecosystem free of human influence, making it natural in the environmentalist sense. At first, she is awestruck by the beauty of the forest, with its rivers and soils which sparkle in their purity. The great silvery tree trunks appear like mighty cathedral columns, far removed from the fungal labyrinths in the jungle above. Here, Nausicaa realizes that the forest is working to purify the polluted earth. However, in the manga, this awe is short-lived, and Nausicaa becomes unsatisfied, questioning the environmentalist ideal by asking what good is this pristine place if it takes hundreds of years of lifeless stone before its restorative powers take effect. Quote, "Maybe it's beautiful down here, but what good is a lifeless world where even insects can't live?" End quote. Nausicaa wants to end the suffering and conflict taking place now for both humans and the insects. For her, the people of the future are of secondary concern. As a result of this questioning, we begin to notice the lifelessness of the stone forest, the great hollow spaces, and the coldness of its glassy tree trunks, petrified and dead. It becomes an environment that is, in a way, more alien than the younger toxic jungle above, since the jungle is at least familiar to us in its wildness and pollution, compared to the distant angelic purity of the stone forest. Part 2. Exploring environmentalism in the manga. As many analysts have shown, in the movie, Miyazaki ultimately gives in to the environmentalist ideal by ending on a hopeful note. A seedling starts to grow in the pristine soil of the stone forest, indicating the beginning of humanity's redemption by nature. However, in the manga, Miyazaki is able to expand on his critique of environmentalist ideals, where he ultimately rejects the idea of a benevolent and pristine nature in its entirety, and instead embraces the complexity and moral ambiguity of the natural world. In Volume 2, Nausicaa comes across an oasis in the desert, filled with the kind of luxuriant herbs and trees that were once common in the old world. She enters a tomb and finds the remains of some ancient mummies whose spirits linger on. In life, these spirits were shamans who worshipped the forest, but they gave up on humanity due to their environmentally destructive ways. They now welcome the obliteration of humanity by the toxic forest, accepting it as part of nature's renewal of the world. Nausicaa, however, refuses to accept this anti-human stance. Quote, "No, our god of the wind tells us to live. I love life. The light, the sky, the people, the insects. I love them all. I won't give up. I won't." End quote. In this sequence, Miyazaki is pointing out the often neglected tendency of many environmentalists who become anti-human in their love of nature, seeing humanity as nothing more than a blight on the earth. Quote, "Often ecologists and nature lovers turn into solitary persons who dislike human beings. They wind up negating human society. Nausicaa is someone who might go over to the insects world if left alone, but who stops just at the last minute. Someone who takes actions that could easily result in death, but instead opens up a new path." End quote. Later, in Volume 3, Nausicaa meets the Forest People, a small society of egalitarian nomads who have relinquished fire and technology so that they can live in the toxic jungle in harmony with nature. They are hunter-gatherers who revere the forest and take from it only what they need for survival. Quote, "The forest people are the ancestors of the worm handlers. They say the most noble of bloodlines, people who have abandoned fire and shunned civilization to live deep in the heart of the forest." End quote. The forest people are Miyazaki's take on the noble savage, an idea which has been around since the 18th century, which argues that those people who live closest to nature, like indigenous hunter-gatherer groups, are the most free, wise, and happy, since all the evils of the world are derived from civilization. Nausicaa forms a deep bond with Selm, the group leader, who rivals her in his knowledge and empathy for the forest. Yet, when Selm proclaims his love for Nausicaa and asks her to live with him in the forest, she refuses. Quote, "Thank you, you make me very happy, but you have placed yourself within the flow of life, whereas I find myself involved with every individual living thing. I love the people of this world too much. I'll have out my life in the twilight of this world that humankind has polluted." End quote. As Nausicaa rejects escaping into the forest, Miyazaki rejects the notion that a harmonious return to our primitive, environmentally friendly roots is possible. For Nausicaa, living with the forest people means abandoning the people of the wasteland in their desperate state. Although she has always dreamed of living in the forest, her responsibility for humanity will always outweigh her romantic dreams of returning to nature. Quote, "Forest people disappear into the forest. They throw away culture. Their lifestyle is not connected to increasing population. Therefore, I don't see how such a people can have a future." End quote. Finally, in Volume 6, Selm takes Nausicaa to the Pure Lands, at the heart of the jungle, where, after centuries of purification, the oldest of the petrified forests have given way to a fertile Eden, where the animals and plants of the old world have finally returned. Nature has restored the wasteland, creating a landscape where people can now farm, fish, and hunt sustainably, living in peace with nature. However, Nausicaa knows that if the people of the wasteland ever found this place, in their current resource-hungry state, the land would be pillaged and destroyed by the warring factions before it could be put to good use. The paradisiacal purified lands must remain out of the reach of humans until they can be trusted to manage it sustainably. Quote, "In 1,000 years or more, you'll spread and grow, and if we can survive, become a little smarter, then we can come join you here." End quote. These plot points force us to reconsider the simplistic environmentalist interpretation of Nausicaa. True nature, free of human influence, is almost entirely absent in Nausicaa's world, and when we do find something approximating the pristine and benevolent nature ideal that environmentalists champion, it's rejected by Miyazaki as an escapist fantasy that offers little to the everyman suffering in the present. Instead, Miyazaki's philosophy on nature is as morally nebulous as the toxic jungle itself, sublime but polluted by savagery, inefficiency, and anti-humanity. Part 3. Society, Science, and Religion. Previous analysts have rightfully identified critiques of industry and nuclear weaponry in Nausicaa, since these are the forces which turn Nausicaa's world into a wasteland. However, our reanalysis reveals several other important points featured in Nausicaa relating to religion, science, and political ideology. In the Doric principalities, the elite priestly class have broken the will of the peasants by eradicating their native tribal faiths and subsuming them under one single state-controlled religion. Their holy symbol is a great eye, which Miraloopa can use to peer into the minds of all that fall under its gaze. The priest's greatest fear is the return of the Angel of Light, a kind of prophet who will free the peasants from their dogmatic state-controlled Doric religion and reunite them with their old tribal faiths. Doric religion mirrors the argument of many atheists. The religion is used as a tool to control the masses through the false belief in an ever-watching, ever-judging God. It's not just faith that is corrupted by the state, but also science and technology. In the Doric nation, a scientist class devoid of morality clamor for the approval of the emperor by creating increasingly fiendish bioweapons for use in his war. Nausicaa's world is full of strange and repugnant denizens, but none are treated with so much contempt and irredeemability as these Doric scientists. Their abstract intelligence belies a complete lack of common sense as they bungle around and trip over themselves. Most occupy the Great Crypt, where all the knowledge of the old world is stored. They live here like maggots burrowing through the old world's malignant corpse, reducing themselves to such a state in the desperate hunt for more knowledge. Quote, "Oh, so you're parasites, the bugs who cling to the crypt, the fool clings to the king." End quote. These are the scientists who create the deadly weaponized mold in service of Miraloopa's war. They plan to drop it on Tolmekian farmland, to cripple their economy and kill hundreds of civilians, but they risk permanently poisoning some of the last fertile ground left on Earth in order to do it. They rejoice in the destructive capabilities of their creation and give no consideration to the long-term suffering it will cause, not only to the enemy, but to their own people caught in the crossfire. The scientists fail to properly contain the mold, and when it breaks free from its bonds, the Doric laboratory is completely engulfed by its growth, and Miyazaki relishes the moment with great detail as the scientists cower, scream, and die at the hands of their own creation. However, despite the evil of Miraloopa and his scientists, Miyazaki does not think that science and technology is inherently bad. Miyazaki sees these things as blank slates, neutral tools which the user imparts their morality onto. Quote, "I think that technology is by itself neutral, innocent. It's like the automobile. Automobiles are extremely loyal to their drivers, and self-sacrificing too. It may be safe to assume that machines don't have souls, but in reality, people impart souls to machines." End quote. The God Warrior and the weaponized mold best express this imparting of morals onto technology. Both appear to be abominations on the surface, an unholy fusion of technology and biology that have the potential to commit genocide. However, they are not inherently evil and begin life as innocent children. The God Warrior literally imprints onto Nausicaa, believing her to be its mother, and Nausicaa teaches it how to be a noble person by channeling its immense power to help liberate the peasantry. The weaponized mold, on the other hand, is so distraught for having been birthed by the pathetic Doric scientists that it lashes out in total anguish against the world. Miraloopa uses technology purely as a means to increase his control over the world, leading to pain and anguish, while Nausicaa uses it as a means to liberate people, which in turn has an ennobling effect. Part 4. Marxist Ideology. The YouTuber Zeria argues that the Valley of the Wind is a Marxist solution to environmental issues, claiming it to be an egalitarian, agrarian utopia where humans and nature live in harmony. However, Miyazaki is no Marxist, and has even gone on record to condemn it as a mistake. Quote, "As I was trying to complete Nausicaa, I experienced a change in my thinking that some people might regard as a political sellout. It's because I clearly abandoned Marxism. You might say I had to abandon it. Marxism was a mistake. I was simply no longer able to deal with the various doubts that had been accumulating as I wrote." End quote. Furthermore, although the people of the valley are good-natured, their society is hardly an egalitarian utopia. The valley is not strictly egalitarian, since it's ruled by a monarchy who apparently have much greater wealth compared to the rest of the citizenry. Take, for example, the castle that Nausicaa inhabits, complete with its own gunship, compared to the small cottages everyone else occupies. Quote, "I felt a little hesitation in the beginning, simply because I had made Nausicaa the daughter of Jill, the king of a small nation. But after a while, I no longer cared about that. I've resolved not to think of things in terms of class consciousness. The idea that someone's right just because he's a worker is a total lie. The masses are capable of doing an infinite number of stupid things." End quote. Although the people of the valley live in relative harmony with their environment, cultivating rich fields and orchards, this harmony is extremely delicate, making life in the valley profoundly precarious. All it takes is one spore to find its way in from the toxic jungle, and it can spoil the entire crop, risking famine. Irrespective of the fragility of the valley, all life here is remarkably short, since constant exposure to the toxic jungle means that all people inevitably succumb to the disabling stone paralysis disease. Also, the child mortality rate in the valley is extremely high because of the jungle's poisons. Nausicaa was one of 11 other siblings who all died in childbirth. Miyazaki does not romanticize the traditional agrarian lifestyle, and despite its beauty, this is no utopia. Chapter 4. Reinterpretation. Making sense of Nausicaa. Now that we've done a more thorough reanalysis of Nausicaa and have dispelled some of the falsehoods around the series, we can start to figure out what Nausicaa is actually all about. To answer this question, I take a four-pronged approach that takes into consideration Miyazaki's philosophy of nature, the development of Nausicaa's main characters, the consideration of Miyazaki's thought process while he was creating the series, and finally, a comparison of the anime and manga finales. Part 1. Miyazaki and Nature. Miyazaki's view of nature is much deeper and more expansive than previous analysts have given it credit for. We've already hinted at this by the contradictions we've seen in the toxic jungle, where on the one hand it's an ecosystem where non-human life forms flourish in the absence of human beings, but on the other hand, remains an anthropogenic ecosystem that's evolved from human pollution and technology. Nature and humans are not always binary opposites in Miyazaki's eyes, but are instead interacting and intermingling agents. Even the most inhospitable wilderness can have the imprint of humanity upon it. This relationship also works the other way around, with the seemingly wisest and most conscientious of people having uncontrollable wildness within them. This is our inner nature, which shares with ecosystems the qualities of spontaneous and autonomous growth. It's a non-human realm that exists within humans, the animal instincts and emotions that bubble up uncontrollably from the unconscious part of the psyche. I believe that this connection between ecosystems and the unconscious is the essential quality of Miyazaki's conception of nature. It's the vitalistic life force that fills all living things, including humans, that pushes them to survive and thrive. Although Miyazaki has not made this definition of nature explicit, at least to my knowledge, it can still be clearly surmised through his biographies. Miyazaki frequently speaks about a conventional kind of nature in the environment, an outer nature, which is made up of non-human ecosystems and life forms with various gradations of human impacts. But he also talks about an emotional human nature, an inner nature, which compels people to survive and grow. Quote, "We human beings need both nature left as it is and man-made habitats." End quote. Quote, "I am sure that many of you are worried about a huge array of issues, but the moment your scenario is selected to be made into a film, you'll be yelling hurrah from the top of your lungs. It's in the nature of humans to do so. It's also human nature for our pulses to race when we see some good-looking person next to us, and to feel happy for a while." End quote. Quote, "The first thing that caught my eye was a row of huge cherry trees. What an amazing life force these trees have, I thought." End quote. Quote, "She demonstrates an adaptability and toughness that even she had not been aware of. She realizes that she has a life force in her that makes her capable of bold decisions and actions." End quote. It's important to note here that although the boundaries are blurred between nature and humans, there is still a human-nature dichotomy to be had, since we still have a conscious capacity to reason and create, which extends far beyond that of any other life forms, making us highly distinct from the rest of nature. No other life forms have been able to build an abstract realm of thought through science and art to the extent that we have, nor have any other life forms been able to construct their own artificial environments to the extent that we have with our cities. Therefore, just as the toxic jungle is a place where non-human and human elements meet, our minds are the place where the non-human unconscious realm and the more human conscious meet. Quote, "This forest is also inside your heart." End quote. Quote, "Jules Verne's story of going under the sea overlaps with entering into one's own internal world. The fascination with the sea the story depicts, and the idea that the sea hints at a far deeper and richer world full of secrets, this is the wonder Captain Nemo feels. At the same time, the sea shows the depth of his mind and the depth of the entire world itself." End quote. The conscious realm plunges into the unconscious realm in the same way Nausica plunges into the toxic jungle. The inseparable link between the non-human realm of ecosystems and the emotional realm of the mind makes ecosystems and their non-human components powerful symbols for exploring the unconscious and for articulating emotional experiences. We need only look to the universal prevalence of animals and plants in mythology and storytelling from across the globe in all cultures and time periods as evidence for this. Nausicaa's fungi and forest insects say as much about emotion as they do about the state of environmentalism, and no character better exemplifies this connection than Nausicaa herself. Part 2. Nausicaa and Nature. Nausicaa explores her emotions via non-human life forms throughout the anime and manga, and it's her ability to do this better than any other character, combined with her intense love for human and non-human life, that makes her the ultimate hero of the story. Miyazaki describes Nausicaa as being a kind of Miko, or shaman maiden, who work at Shinto shrines, and previous analysts have also pointed out the similarities between Nausicaa's beliefs and those of Shintoists. Shintoists and shamans practice animism, that is, they both commune with non-human entities. Both see that the non-human world, the world of flora, fauna, rivers and rocks, are suffused with emotion and meaning. The shaman is tasked with communicating these findings from the non-human world to the benefit of other members of the community, while the Shintoist is tasked with devout reverence. Nausicaa, of course, does both. When it comes to emotional exploration, the toxic jungle means everything to Nausicaa. Despite its dangers, Nausicaa has learned how to navigate the fungal forest with ease, and can lose herself in it as if in a waking dream, letting intuition guide her wandering mind. The forest symbols, the insects and fungi, elicit within Nausicaa and the reader a feeling of absolute wonder and mystery that comes with encountering something truly other. In Volume 4, Miyazaki makes this connection between ecology and the unconscious explicit, when Selm and the Ohm guide Nausicaa through the jungle of her own mind. Selm is in awe of how similar Nausicaa's internal forest is to the physical toxic jungle, in terms of its depth and complexity. Quote, "Your forest is deep. I've never been on so rich a journey." End quote. Nausicaa's love of nature and her openness to explore her inner emotional forest realm is what gives her power as a hero. Although completely removed from the anime, in the manga, Nausicaa has psychic abilities that allow her to communicate with non-human life forms. As she matures throughout the story, so too do her psychic powers, which she uses to connect with increasingly powerful beings, from tiny Tito the fox squirrel all the way up to the Ohm, the mightiest and wisest of the forest insects, who in turn grant her even greater insights into her unconscious. Nausicaa is a wind rider, a sacred and revered position in valley culture. Her skill at riding the wind reflects her ability to adeptly interpret the currents of her intuition and her willingness to trust in natural forces greater than herself. Her wind glider, then, demonstrates how her conscious mind has become attuned towards harnessing nature's currents in the least detrimental way possible. The glider is elegant in its simplicity, a design which has abandoned everything non-essential to harnessing the wind, in the same way that Nausicaa's consciousness is attuned to hearing the whispers from the unconscious. This contrasts with the monstrous Tolmekian skyships, whose hugeness and arrays of whirling bits convey the doomed machinations of an overly conscious mind, hell-bent on bringing nature under its complete control. Part 3. Nausicaa's love for humanity. Nausicaa is not the only character who derives power from nature. Selm, the leader of the forest people, and the shaman spirit Nausicaa encounters in the oasis are also wise psychics who revere the forest. However, Nausicaa differs from the other forest-loving characters and ultimately exceeds their levels of power due to the great love she also has for human life. The spirit shaman gives up on humans for the damage they have done to nature, while Selm and the forest people have effectively abandoned humanity to live in harmony with the forest. But Nausicaa refuses to give up on the wastelanders out of a love for all life. Indeed, Nausicaa does not enter the toxic jungle just to explore her inner being. She goes there to try and help people. She enters the forest to scavenge vital resources for the valley, and it's where she goes to research the forest toxins so she can find a cure for the deadly stone disease that plagues her people. Nausicaa does these things for people in spite of the fact that she's been hurt and ostracized by them for her love of nature. As a young girl, Nausicaa was singled out by the villagers for trying to protect a baby Ohm that had wandered into the valley. Her own father, the king, symbol of law and order, scolds Nausicaa for sheltering the Ohm, since insects threaten valley life with their toxic spores. He snatches the Ohm to have it put down, leaving Nausicaa traumatized. Here Nausicaa learns how isolated she is in her love of the insects, and she experiences the coldness that comes from divorcing nature from culture. However, despite the emotional pain inflicted on her by society, Nausicaa understands why these laws exist, and she does not harbor resentment. The cruelties of life and the responsibilities she feels towards other people will always prevent her from going over entirely to the fancy and mysticism of the forest. Instead, she turns her love for nature into a means to help other people and avoids the escapist trap that the other nature lovers fall into. Part 4. Nausicaa's Dark Side. Nausicaa brims with a pure love for life and looks at the world with a kind of childlike awe that is often lost to adults. Her effervescence and spontaneity have a transfixing effect that pulls both the reader and those around her into support of her campaign. However, her childlike tendencies are balanced by an intense maturity. She has a knowingness in her eyes and an aura of wisdom that garners respect wherever she goes. Quote, "A good child, a mix of tenderness and courage, very deep." End quote. This is because, in exploring her unconscious, Nausicaa comes up against the uglier side of herself, an inner darkness or shadow nature that many would resist or deny, which she instead wrestles with and accepts. This shadow in Nausicaa's soul is symbolized by the dark and grotesque elements of the toxic jungle that Nausicaa openly embraces. Her first encounter with the shadow occurs in Volume 1 of the manga. Nausicaa flies into a blind rage and attempts to kill Tolmekian soldiers when she sees that they have brought polluted worm handlers with them into the valley. In doing this, she realizes that there is a deadly aggression inside of her. Nausicaa does not deny or attempt to conceal this darkness, but instead integrates it into an understanding of her being. This wild aggression is something Nausicaa shares with the creatures of the forest, and it actually helps her to further empathize with them. Quote, "There's a terrible hatred hiding inside me. I can understand now how the Ohm felt. The hate takes over and makes him kill, and then he cries." End quote. Nausicaa loses any comforting illusions of being an inherently non-violent person. This revelation coincides with the burning of the ancient valley tree, a symbol of the purity Nausicaa once cherished, being destroyed. As the tree burns, Nausicaa prepares to leave the valley as part of a historic Tolmekian Valley pact. She turns off the water supply to her garden, killing the fungi she had been growing in secret. These fungi had been purified of their toxins by Nausicaa through scientific methods, but would not be able to survive in her absence. For so long, Nausicaa had carefully cultivated an idea of herself free of darkness, in the same way that she had long tried to scrub away the pollution from the jungle. But neither her inner shadow nature nor cultural circumstance will allow her to continue to cultivate this view, too precious and secluded from the world to be helpful to her. Nausicaa realizes that there can be no return to innocence, and that she is destined to confront her inner darkness in strange and foreign lands. Although the valley elders revere the forest, they still fear it greatly as a place where dark supernatural powers dwell. They worry that Nausicaa's forest venturings border on harmful obsession, and that she risks becoming possessed by evil forest forces. Quote, "There's an old saying, 'Look not into the heart of the Ohm.' They say if you do, you'll never come back." End quote. Nausicaa is like a witch in this respect, since her powers reflect something weird and obscure to common folks. Indeed, she is likened to a witch on more than one occasion by other characters. At her lowest point, overwhelmed by the cruelty of war, Nausicaa attempts to commit suicide by diving into the toxic mold, to be fully consumed by nature and rendered totally unconscious of suffering once and for all. She sinks into the depths of the mold, but the Ohm refuse to let her die, coating her in a protective serum. Nausicaa stares into the abyssal heart of the Ohm, and the spirit of growth ignites to protect her. She arises from the mold reborn, just as a new forest begins to sprout. From this shadowy union with nature, she gains the ability to breathe the toxic jungle air, representing the full maturation of her strength. Quote, "The mind of a fragile person would be destroyed by the sight of that abyss, because the one who looks into that darkness must endure the gaze returned by the darkness itself." End quote. Quote, "The greatness of a mind is determined by the depth of its suffering." End quote. It's no coincidence that the worm handlers of all people should be the first to recognize Nausicaa's newly found dark powers, as they proclaim her their deity, a living embodiment of the forest. Having spent so much time in the jungle, they have become ostracized by the more civilized world, reviled as filthy scavengers polluted by spores. Like Nausicaa, the worm handlers blur the boundary between nature and civilization, shadow and light, pristine and polluted. To have one of these maggot men so much as approach you is considered a defilement of one's character. Even Nausicaa herself, the brightest symbol of empathy Miyazaki has to offer, is so disgusted by the mere presence of worm handlers in her kingdom that she flies into a blind rage. Poetically, it's this same feeling of disgust which triggers her murderous anger in the first volume of the manga, leading her to first reflect on her own shadow side. In becoming queen of the worm handlers, Nausicaa comes full circle, fully embracing that lowliest part of humanity that had once defiled her pristine valley kingdom. With the worm handlers on her side, Nausicaa gains a shadowy army, as tainted by the pollution of life as she is, to lay siege to the Crypt Keeper. Having wrestled with the darkest aspects of herself, she now empathizes far more deeply with other life forms, since she recognizes that there is always a redeeming quality, even in the lowliest of experiences. Quote, "Life is light. You are wrong. Life is the light that shines in the darkness." End quote. Quote, "The lowest caste was the race of worm handlers. But the question is, why were they directly connected to Nausicaa? It's because since ancient times, there has always been a profound connection between the emperor and the lowest caste. At first, Nausicaa couldn't bring herself to use the worms. She didn't accept them after studying and thinking on the problem. Her experiences and enlarged viewpoint enabled her to do so." End quote. For the fully matured Nausicaa, her enemy is no longer the darkness found in the abyss of her soul, but the comforting allure that comes from her loftiest ideals. In Volume 7, near the end of the manga, Nausicaa finds herself in a secret garden, filled with beautiful plants from the old world, peaceful animals, and a vast ancient library. The place is like a paradise for Nausicaa, where she can live carefree in harmony with nature, while studying the secret arts and sciences of the advanced but long-gone societies. Quote, "Where am I? Heaven?" End quote. However, this garden is a trap specifically architected by the Crypt Keeper to ensnare Nausicaa by using her desires against her. Nausicaa becomes lost in pleasure, and in forgetting all she strove for in the real world, she loses all sense of time and urgency. Eventually, an insidious feeling that things are too good to be true arises in Nausicaa, and she attempts to escape the garden. The keeper takes the form of Nausicaa's mother, assuming that it would provide a comforting visage to pacify her with. However, this Oedipal tactic backfires, since Nausicaa does not associate her mother with comfort, but is instead reminded of deep trauma. Nausicaa was never loved by her mother, since Nausicaa only ever served as a horrible reminder of the 11 children who had come before her, all of whom had died in childbirth, poisoned in the womb by fungal spores. An awareness of this deep-seated pain liberates Nausicaa from the manipulation of the Crypt Keeper and allows her to escape. Quote, "You enter their hearts and make them forget their sorrows and pain, and turn them into your servants. I remembered my mother because you have the same scent of death about you as she did." End quote. Part 5. Comparing Nausicaa to other characters. The power of emotional openness can also be seen amongst many of the most important side characters, whose personal trajectories often rest on how well they can embrace their feelings and connect with nature like Nausicaa does. Both Kushana and Nausicaa bear striking similarities in terms of their appearance, position in society, and character. Both have red hair and similar facial features. Both are princesses, beloved by their people for their sense of fairness and justice, and both are fearsome warriors. However, it's in their relationship to nature, both inside and outside of themselves, where they differ starkly. Kushana, for all her bravery and martial prowess, is unable to process the trauma of her past. As a child, she was frequently exposed to the murderous infighting of her father's court, and her mother was emotionally absent, having been driven insane by the king. Instead of facing the painful emotions of childhood, Kushana repressed them for fear of admitting to weakness. She underwent an intense military training, channeling her energy into leading armies and carefully plotting ways to get revenge on her family. This strict self-control and denial of her inner nature is mirrored by her destructive attitude towards the toxic jungle. Kushana projects her repressed emotions outwards into the forest, seeing it as a threatening wilderness which mirrors her tortured inner state. She disregards the laws of the forest as mere superstition and commits acts of violence against it to try and bring it under her control. When she loses her arm to an insect attack, an event that is almost always provoked, she doesn't question her approach but curses nature all the more. She replaces her arm with a powerful military prosthetic in an attempt to replace nature with mechanism, which further cements her repressive and distancing attitude towards her emotional self. At first, Kushana brushes off Nausicaa's emotional openness as mere naivety, a form of weakness in her eyes, but in time she comes to see that it's exactly this quality which gives Nausicaa her mystifying strength. Kushana's character growth culminates in Volume 3, when, in the midst of an insect attack, she finds herself dug in and at death's door. Cornered and wounded, she comes face to face with an enraged insect. Instead of putting up one last exhausted fight, she thinks of the advice that Nausicaa had given her, that to quell the rage of the insects, you must, quote, cast aside your hatred and fears, the insects won't attack, end quote. Faced up against nature's fury, with her life truly on the line, Kushana finally lets her guard down, allowing the emotions to come forth, and instead of feeling pain, she feels immense relief. She frees herself from her self-imposed cage, reconnects with her inner nature, and quells the insect's fury. Then there's Kurotawa, who in many ways is the exact opposite of Nausicaa. He's of common birth, as opposed to royalty, and has worked his way up through the ranks pragmatically, utilizing a cunning intellect. While Nausicaa gains respect through her emotional openness and intuitive acuity, Kurotawa gains it by maintaining a grounded, practical, and strategic mindset. He sees the details that the heraldic nobility, lazy in their privilege, often miss or disregard as beneath their station. As a result, Kurotawa has a great capacity for evil, but because of his great admiration for Kushana, he remains loyal to the cause, using his cunning only against those who would try and stop her. This principled utilization of his shadow makes Kurotawa one of the most interestingly admirable characters in Nausicaa's world. Kurotawa shows Nausicaa that hands will always be dirtied in war, no matter the side. Circumstance forces him to make strategic decisions that are so brutal that Nausicaa is unable to come to terms with them until she herself becomes a leader of her own army near the end of the manga. When a swarm of rampaging Ohm threatens to destroy Kushana's fleet in Volume 1, only Kurotawa has the grit to abandon those men left on the ground in order to save the majority of the crew. Kurotawa's pragmatism is necessary for his survival in a violent world, but he's distanced from his own emotions and the pain and suffering of others as a result. He's a cynic through and through, and it's this lack of emotional openness that ultimately places Nausicaa in a position to grow above and beyond Kurotawa. His hard pragmatic perspective creates friction between him and Nausicaa at first, as Nausicaa continues to defy his expectations of war by giving protection to increasing numbers of refugees. Quote, Nausicaa, what do you think you're doing collecting brats like that? They're not coming with us, by God. This is war. Where we're going, there'll be kids like that lying around by the hundreds. End quote. However, Nausicaa eventually breaks this seal within Kurotawa, culminating in an act of poignant self-sacrifice. In Volume 3, one of Kurotawa's soldiers lies dying, having been poisoned by toxic jungle spores. While the other soldiers call out in desperation, Kurotawa coldly resigns this soldier to his fate, knowing that there is no cure for the poison, and instead tries to regain control of his men through a morale-boosting speech. However, to Kurotawa's surprise, Nausicaa steps forward and tries to suck the poison out of the soldier. With this kiss of life, she knowingly takes the poisons into her own body, sacrificing herself for this soldier in an act that completely defies Kurotawa's cynical outlook. Nausicaa miraculously survives this encounter, but she had no way of knowing that she would. Having witnessed this miraculous act of self-sacrifice, Kurotawa opens himself up to a realm beyond practicalities and strategies, into Nausicaa's realm of the unconscious and the emotional. He finds himself making an equally impulsive and dangerous decision due to Nausicaa's power when he jumps headfirst into an insect's nest to rescue Nausicaa, in an act that Kushana rightfully identifies as being completely unlike the old Kurotawa. Quote, that girl has a mysterious power about her, Kurotawa. Look at yourself. A practical, cautious fellow like you, jumping into that well the instant you heard she was in danger? End quote. Master Yupa is Nausicaa's teacher, confidant, and closest ally. He's a warrior sage famed across all the kingdoms as the wisest and most deadly of the sword masters. He sees immense potential in Nausicaa and tutors her in the way of swordsmanship and statecraft. Like Nausicaa, he has a fascination with the toxic jungle and wants to uncover its secrets. No wastelander has explored the jungle as thoroughly as Yupa, and none have accrued as much forest lore as he. However, for all his searching and knowledge, it's actually Nausicaa who uncovers the secret of the forest's deadly toxins from the comfort of her own home, realizing that when the fungi are cultivated in the clean valley soils, they grow free of poison. The visionary farsightedness that compelled Yupa to venture out and explore the world may have made him wise and strong, but he was still unaware of the soil beneath his feet, seemingly unremarkable in its earthy modesty. Nausicaa, on the other hand, although appreciating the power of knowledge, is never blinded by it, placing more faith in her unconscious intuition. She understands that a person need not travel to the edges of the world to gain new knowledge, since the greatest revelations in understanding come from within. For Miyazaki, all the knowledge in the world cannot replace a little intuition. Quote, "What a fool I've been. I've spent half my life searching for the key to the mystery of the forest, and I never saw that it was inside this girl, right before my eyes." End quote. Finally, there are the brothers Miraloopa and Namalif, the shadowy co-regents of the Doric Empire, who manipulate both science and faith to gain control of the world. Unlike Nausica, the brothers have given up all faith in human beings, seeing them as nothing more than materials to be brought under control. However, the older brother Miraloopa was not always this way, in fact quite the opposite. As a young man, Miraloopa wanted to be a benevolent philosopher king, utterly dedicated to improving the lives of his citizens. In this way, he mirrors his father, the first Holy Emperor, who spent years in tutelage with the Crypt Keeper, learning how to heal the sick, educate the poor, and improve agricultural yields via bioengineered servants. However, when he returned and tried to enact his new enlightened policies, the people rejected them. The peasants were suspicious of the emperor and his new technologies after having suffered so long under tyrannical rule. They did not care for the new policies, preferring their own traditions and wisdoms. Miraloopa and Namalif, like their father before them, grew wary of the peasants, and their festering resentment towards them grew. Miraloopa's idealized vision of himself as a merciful king and his citizenry as innocent yet malleable lambs faded quickly, revealing his benevolence to be little more than a facade. When the world failed to neatly conform to his idealized self-image, he abandoned it outright as a lost cause in a misguided attempt at self-preservation, washing his hands clean of all the moral and practical complexities of real life. Miraloopa, then, is the antithesis of Nausica, who in failing to integrate the darkness in himself and empathize with the darkness in others, is unable to mature and instead stagnates, becoming a resent-filled antagonist. Part 6. Miyazaki's thought process while making Nausica. Nausica, then, is first and foremost about the power of emotional growth and the balancing act between the protagonist's inner emotions and her responsibilities towards her fellow humans. This forms the essential motivation and source of tension for Nausica, symbolized through her attempts to reconcile the relationship between the toxic jungle and the wasteland cultures. Any environmentalist themes, at least conventional ones, are secondary to Miyazaki's psychological and vitalistic perspective on nature, which places the emotional growth of individuals and the power of nature to convey and ignite this growth above all else. This relationship that Nausica has to nature, both in the environment and in herself, is drastically simplified in the anime, with Miyazaki crafting a highly artificial and unrealistic binary between benevolent ecosystems and the ignorance of humans, befitting a traditional environmentalist narrative. The nature of the toxic jungle is fundamentally good, since in its non-polluted, pristine form, it exists to heal the world and make it inhabitable for humans once again. On the other hand, its deadly character, the poison spores and insect rampages, are primarily the result of human provocation. Nausica's reconciliation of nature and humanity is relatively simple under this framework, since all she has to do is stamp out the ignorance, greed, and anger in people to fix the divide. In retrospect, the anime Nausica, champion of nature's purity, is a complete betrayal of the fully formed manga character, who must learn to embrace the polluted nature of humans and ecosystems alike in all their darkness. Quote, "I've always felt that we blind ourselves by looking at the world simply in terms of purity and corruption." End quote. The nuanced ideas that Miyazaki starts to explore in the first volume of the manga, the volume that would go on to be reconstituted into the anime, are either brushed over, like Nausicaa's love of the polluted and often disturbing toxic jungle, or are simply removed altogether, like Nausicaa's ambivalence towards the stone forest and her psychic powers. Since the release of the anime, Miyazaki has admitted that his framing of the pristine forest as an ecosystem that solely exists to clean the world for people was a regrettable mistake, and that his views on nature developed radically over the course of creating the subsequent manga. Quote, "The idea that nature is always gentle and will give birth to something like the Sea of Decay in order to restore an environment polluted by humans is a total lie. And I believe that the idea that we should cling to such a saccharine worldview is a big problem. That, at least, is what I felt while writing Nausica. From the very beginning, I suspected that I would arrive at such a conclusion." End quote. Miyazaki cites two reasons for having made this mistake. One, that he was restricted by the medium of film as a means to explore complex themes in a way that he was not with the manga. Quote, "That's all you can do with film. It's important that Nausica, the heroine, discover the real role, structure, and significance of the Fukai, or Sea of Decay, and as a result trigger a Copernican-like revolution in understanding. I had decided that that was about all I could show in a film version, but there were too many elements still in my mind that wouldn't fit into that simplified framework, and it bothered me that I couldn't make them work." End quote. And two, that to voice his true feelings about ecosystems would be a betrayal to his readers. Quote, "There was always this thought that such a conclusion wouldn't work for the story, that it would be a betrayal of my readers, but that thinking was flawed. Ecosystems can't possibly exist for a particular purpose. Nausica, the heroine, learns the truth behind the Sea of Decay, but it's almost impossible for her to explain it to people in words." End quote. When writing the manga, something pushed Miyazaki to confront his more ambivalent and complex views on nature and honestly spell them out to his readers. I believe that Miyazaki used the world of Nausica as a way to explore his actual feelings towards nature, as well as a way to confront his own inner darkness. This emotional exploration led Miyazaki to reject his idealized intellectual stances towards environment and society and instead embrace a way of life that prioritizes feeling. Miyazaki has admitted that when he was working on Nausica, he felt a great deal of anger at the world in terms of the environmental and humanitarian issues going on at the time. Quote, "I was extremely irritated at the time. I confess I was angry at the general state of the world, among other things. It was right around 1980. In addition to being upset by environmental problems, I was also concerned about where humanity was headed, and especially about the state of Japan." End quote. These feelings are clearly expressed in Nausica as cultural critiques of industrialism, war, religion, and science. However, Miyazaki admits that these feelings of anger towards the world were secondary compared to the feelings of anger he had towards himself. Quote, "Most of all, I suspect I was angered by the state of my own self." End quote. We also know from Starting Point that Miyazaki used his ideals to repress his emotions, much to his own detriment. Quote, "Using my own sense of what's proper, I've twisted and suppressed my initial subjective impressions." End quote. This repression mirrors the experiences of Kushana and Miraloopa in the manga. However, by focusing on himself instead of the state of the world, Miyazaki was able to come to terms with his feelings, putting him on a new path, the same path as Nausica, where worldly knowledge is traded in for intuition and personal growth. Quote, "Well, I don't do that anymore. Even when looking at today's politicians, I just rely on my impressions. In other words, I've reverted to being a true simpleton. My position isn't a popular one, but I say we'd be better off solving far more personal problems." End quote. Miyazaki has stated multiple times that in making the manga, he prioritized the expression of spontaneous ideas and feelings, even if it was to the detriment of his initial plans, highlighting Miyazaki's prioritization of natural growth over artificial control. Quote, "Even if not explicitly written or drawn in the original manga story, there were many personal feelings, as well as my own wild ideas. I wrote it thinking that maybe I should go in this or that direction, and then just followed my whim." End quote. Quote, "When creating a work like Nausica, all sorts of ideas, even random fragments of ideas, come to me. I just have to assume that they mean something. I can't ignore these fragments, even if they might destroy the story structure." End quote. The evidence for Miyazaki's break with his old intellectual ideals does not end there. For one, we know that it was in writing Nausicaa that Miyazaki abandoned the ideology of Marxism. Quote, "I don't think I abandoned Marxism because of any change in my position within society. On the contrary, I feel that it came from having written Nausicaa." End quote. As previously discussed, Miyazaki takes a staunchly cynical perspective on intellectualism and idealism throughout the manga. He criticizes various thought leaders, like scientists, priests, environmentalists, and ecologists, while simultaneously raising the emotion-led Nausicaa to a deific status, making her the goddess of the forest, further reinforcing the idea that Miyazaki broke from intellectualism and placed his faith in feeling. Technology, although inherently neutral in Miyazaki's eyes, still becomes an overwhelmingly violent force when in the hands of the calculating scientists and the controlling Miraloopa. But it's seen as a noble force when Nausicaa uses it to liberate people from control. Finally, in relation to idealism, Nausicaa's character growth mainly comes from her ability to connect with the dark aspects of her character, as symbolized by the polluted denizens of the toxic jungle, and it's her comforting ideals which actually stifle her true development. Part 7. Comparing the anime and manga finales. This transition in Miyazaki's philosophy is most clearly expressed in the finale of the Nausicaa manga. This ending represents a tipping point where Miyazaki finally rids himself of his repressive intellectual ideals, that is, his sense of what is, quote, proper, end quote, and gives into his more honest feelings. The result is a finale diametrically opposed to the anime ending, both in terms of the themes conveyed and the morality of Nausicaa. As a result, this ending represents a direct self-criticism of the mindset that underpinned the anime, with its dichotomy between an ideal state of pure nature versus corrupt human pollution. In the anime, it's nature's purity that offers the ultimate salvation for humanity, as we see a sapling growing in the clean soils of the petrified forest, ushering in a new age of environmental cleanliness. However, in the manga finale, it's this same desire for purity that drives the antagonistic crypt keeper. Nausicaa learns that the petrified forest is not a natural consequence of ecosystem development, but is an artificial construct designed by the ecologists of the old world to bring about an age of purity. With this revelation, Miyazaki and Nausicaa completely reject the idealized environmentalist basis of the anime, the idea that ecosystems could naturally develop with the sole goal of purifying the environment. Quote, "It was planned from the beginning, an ecosystem with a goal. Its very existence runs contrary to the laws of nature." End quote. It's also revealed to Nausicaa that the people who inhabit the wasteland have all had their bodies tainted by the toxic jungle. When the petrified forest ushers in a new age of environmental purity, all those who have been tainted by spores will die, since they will no longer be capable of breathing clean air. With this, Miyazaki does not just abandon the idea of purity as a benevolent force, but actually turns it into a direct threat to humanity. The message is clear. Human beings are infused with pollution, just like the toxic jungle is, and to attempt to become pure is a folly tantamount to death. Quote, "Although we may long for a purified world, we could never survive there. That the human body is different from what it once was." End quote. In the anime finale, we see Nausicaa at her most virtuous. Her love for life is absolute, and she'll even sacrifice her own life to end the conflict between the insects and the humans. When she is resurrected by the Ohm, she arises as a prophesized angelic deity walking on a field of gold. This is Nausicaa the pristine hero, a shamanic peacekeeper ushering in a sustainable future where both humans and nature can live in environmental harmony. However, in the manga finale, Nausicaa has fully embraced her shadow, transitioning from peacekeeper to warrior queen, resolute in her quest to destroy the crypt keeper, who she sees as an affront to life itself. Instead of decrying the use of the god warrior, as she does in the anime, she instead uses the warrior as a weapon to storm the Doric capital. Instead of being covered in the blue blood of the baby Ohm she tried to save, she is bathed in the blood of her god warrior child, who she sacrifices to achieve her victory. At the bottom of the crypt, Nausicaa finally confronts the Keeper, who not only holds the key to all the advanced scientific knowledge of the past, but also the embryos of a new purified human race. They are waiting for the great purification to be complete, so that they may live in a world free of pollution, even if it means the deaths of countless more. Quote, "We speak to you as representatives of the great many who died meaningless deaths because of their own folly. You are living in the long period of purification, but the day will come when the sea of corruption ceases to be, and a pure, green land is reborn." End quote. Nausicaa is abhorred that the ecologists of the old world could happily sacrifice the corrupted wastelanders for the sake of some idealized state of purity. Having grown so much by accepting her inner darkness, Nausicaa now reviles the notion of purity and believes that nature is inherently impure, as it's built on death and the necessity to survive. Nor does Nausicaa believe that nature can be so easily controlled, since no ecologist could have predicted the evolution of the toxic jungle, the self-sacrificing actions of the ohm, and the immense emotion felt by the giant mold. Quote, "I do not doubt that you were created out of idealism. Why didn't those men and women realize that both purity and corruption are the very stuff of life? Because you were created as an artificial god of purity, you have become the ugliest creature of all, never knowing what it means to be alive. Are we supposed to believe that those who planned the reconstruction of the world could have predicted the actions of the ohm or the giant mold? I don't think so. Something inside me is telling me passionately that it isn't true." End quote. Nausicaa thinks that the only way to break the cycle of control over life is to sever the link to the puritanical old world by killing the Crypt Keeper, whose technologies will always attract immature and wicked people desperate for control over nature. She will do this even if it means killing the many new humans in stasis and destroying all of the advanced knowledge of the old world. Nausicaa would sooner let humans live out the twilight of their species, corrupted in a polluted world where they are free to grow, rather than have them sacrificed for some sterilized future controlled by the scientists. Quote, "To live is to change. The ohm, the mold, the grasses, and the trees. We human beings, we will all go on changing. But you cannot change. You have only the plan that was built into you, because you deny death." End quote. All the easily digestible idealism of the anime protagonist has been stripped away, revealing Nausicaa in her rawest and most morally questionable form. This ending has been perfectly designed to challenge the reader's relationship to the protagonist, to see that Nausicaa's commitment to nature in all its forms is so strong that she would act out murder to achieve it. A story that champions purity needs a pure hero, and a story that challenges the notion of purity needs a corrupted one. Part 8. The True Meaning of Nausicaa Summarized. Miyazaki, like the trees of the petrified forest, was frozen in stone by his ideals and intellect, isolated from the wondrous toxic jungle of his own emotional self. By exploring his inner forest and confronting it in all its darkness, Miyazaki, like Nausicaa, gained the once unconscious powers of the ohm, the vitalistic power of growth, the stuff of life itself. As a result, Miyazaki experienced revelations that shook the foundations of both his personal worldview and the world of Nausicaa, which were in turn expressed through Nausicaa's own revelations. The Crypt Keeper, Miraloopa, and the scientists all hid from their emotions, deceiving themselves with false hopes that they could control nature both within and outside of themselves, and bend it to fit their superficial ideals. They refused to admit any inner darkness, believing themselves to be pure. Instead, they feared the dark, and their insecurities drove them to seek more and more control. Miyazaki demands that we give up our intellectual frameworks and become true simpletons, embracing nature's gift of sincere feeling, in the same way he did while writing Nausicaa. If we hold on to our love for all forms of life, we will have the courage to give up control to nature, peer into the darkness of ourselves, and sacrifice our self-deceptions. Then we will realize how powerful we really are, and we will become much more aware of the responsibilities we have towards the environment, our fellow humans, and ourselves. Part 9. Legacy. This change in Miyazaki's outlook from intellectual idealist to emotional realist would mark a profound shift in his artistic career, laying a philosophical foundation for some of the most significant animes of all time. Nausicaa the anime is, and remains, the only Miyazaki film that deals with environmental themes through a conventional environmentalist lens, where good ecosystems are pitted against destructive humans. All films following on from the publication of the manga in which ecosystems are prominently featured, like My Neighbor Totoro, Princess Mononoke, and Ponyo, deal with the ecological-human relationship in much more emotional, and in the case of Princess Mononoke, ambivalent ways. My Neighbor Totoro and Ponyo convey how much childlike joy and wonder there is to be found in nature, as expressed through its ability to grow and its vast diversity of forms. In My Neighbor Totoro, Satsuki and Mei revel in delight when Totoro helps them to grow a gigantic camphor tree from seeds that they had planted that very same day, while Ponyo and Sosuke marvel at the many varieties of brightly coloured sea creatures that they see when they sail on their little boat through the flooded town. However, neither film comments on environmental destruction in any explicit way, simply letting nature and people be, which is a far cry from the tone set in the Nausica anime. In Princess Mononoke, Miyazaki brings his ambivalent perspective towards nature-human relations to the silver screen in an attempt to correct the mistakes made in the Nausicaa film. As in Nausicaa, the conflict in Princess Mononoke revolves around humans who destroy the forests and the forest denizens who retaliate in response. However, unlike in the Nausicaa anime, Miyazaki instead presents strong cases for and against both sides, and ends on an extremely ambivalent note. On the side of nature is San, the human child raised by wolves, and the gods of the forest, gigantic sentient animals who protect the forest and fill it with powerful magic. The forest is deep, mystical, and deserving of reverence. Giant trees are inhabited by spirits, and forest springs can heal the sick. Indeed, life itself comes from a great forest spirit called the deer god. Although humans abandoned San as a child, Moro the wolf god was willing to raise her as if one of her own. She gave San the strength to survive, but also taught her how to care for all the creatures of the forest. Although it was the humans who began the conflict against nature by shooting Lord Nago, the boar god, the forest denizens are far from being passive and innocent victims. The forest inhabitants are filled with an indiscriminate and murderous hatred towards humans and constantly bicker amongst one another for the deer god's favor. For example, it was Nago's hatred for humanity that turned him into a demon when he was shot, and instead of turning his anger towards Lady Eboshi, the culprit, he instead went on a destructive rampage amongst the innocent Emishi people, who in fact revere the forest. On the side of the humans is Lady Eboshi, the ambitious and progressive leader of Irontown. She exploits the forest to keep her forges burning, and wants to kill the gods so she can take complete control of the ore-rich hills. Her ambition, though, is not due to mere greed, but stems from a resentment of the social inequalities rife in feudal Japan, and a genuine desire to empower marginalized groups. She cares for lepers, who would have otherwise been completely ostracized from society, and she emancipates women who would otherwise be forced into prostitution. The people of Irontown love and admire their Lady Eboshi, and will even lay down their lives for the sake of her vision. Ultimately, though, her lust for power gets the better of her, and she commits single-mindedly to the killing of the deer god in a blind attempt to gain complete control over the forest, risking everything she had built in the process. In the end, when Eboshi beheads the forest spirit, the forest dies and Irontown is destroyed in the process. Unlike in the Nausicaa anime, there is no comfortable reconciliation of nature and humanity in Princess Mononoke, and it instead ends on an ambivalent note much more in keeping with the ending of the Nausicaa manga. Lady Eboshi and the villagers survived the destruction of Irontown, and although Eboshi is humbled by the experience, her future intentions remain unclear, and she simply states that she will start again and build, quote, a good village, end quote. San is unable to forgive humanity for the destruction caused to the forest, and despite the protagonist's efforts, she refuses to join civilization and decides that she must continue to live away from people in the wilderness. As with the Nausicaa manga, the only certainty we are left with is that life will continue in spite of any reconciliation between nature and man, and even in the absence of the forest gods, things will continue to grow. Quote, even if they grow back, they won't be the deer god's woods. The deer god is dead. The deer god can't die. He is life itself. He's telling us we should live. End quote. In Spirited Away, ecological explorations take a backseat, and the focus falls on the importance of emotional growth as a means to survive and thrive in the world. Chihiro begins the story as a protected child, who feels largely indifferent towards the world. However, When she's separated from her parents and forced to work in the demon's bathhouse, she has no choice but to embrace the horror of the situation and to learn to be independent. Just as in the Nausica manga, comfort and denial are insidious villains here. Yubaba nurses the giant baby, who refuses to grow up, just as Chihiro nurses the infant inside of herself, until she becomes willing to openly confront the grim realities of life. This mirrors Nausicaa's realization that she is not as innocent as she once believed herself to be. And, as Nausicaa realizes that she must escape from the edible care of the Crypt Keeper and his Garden of Delights, Chihiro learns that she will never escape the bathhouse unless she gains a stronger sense of self. Quote, "Today's children feel shielded, protected, and distanced from reality, to the point where they only have a vague sense of what it means to be alive. Chihiro's skinny limbs and her deliberately miffed and apathetic expressions are a symbol of this. But as reality sets in, and as she directly confronts danger from which she cannot easily extricate herself, she demonstrates an adaptability and toughness that even she had not been aware of. She realizes that she has a life force in her that makes her capable of bold decisions and actions." Chapter 5. Conclusion. This reanalysis of the Nausica series leads us to question the traditional environmentalist and Marxist interpretations of the franchise. Both Miyazaki and Nausicaa are staunchly opposed to the idea of pure and benevolent nature, believing that nature's power comes from its savage and polluted aspects, as embodied by the toxic jungle. Miyazaki criticizes environmentalists for their tendency to become anti-human in their appreciation of nature, as expressed through the mummified shaman and the forest people. The idea that Nausicaa was intended to be Marxist is plainly wrong, since Miyazaki has stated that writing Nausicaa actually made him give up the ideology. Instead, the true meaning of Nausicaa lies in the power of ecology to capture and convey feelings and the importance of emotional exploration, particularly that of a dark and troubling nature. Nausicaa is an emotional ecologist who uses her feelings, above all else, to guide her actions. This connection to the unconscious, the realm of spontaneous and uncontrolled growth, ties Nausicaa inextricably to nature, as symbolized by the toxic jungle of her mind. Nausicaa gains strength by looking deep into the darkness of her soul and accepting what she finds, no matter how painful. It is when she is at her lowest, driven to despair by the horrors of war, that she plunges into the depths of the jungle abyss and is reborn as a forest god. Previous to writing the manga, Miyazaki twisted his environmental and social ideals to repress an anger he felt towards himself. Nausicaa helped Miyazaki to embrace his true inner feelings, leading him to abandon his old ideological stances on environmentalism, Marxism, and intellectualism more generally. Miyazaki decries the intellectuals of his world, painting scientists, priests, and ecologists as power-hungry, manipulative, and controlling antagonists, whose growth is stunted by superficial idealism that all quickly falls away once they get hold of the crypt's technology. The traditional environmentalist narrative established in the Nausicaa movie, with its purifying forest endangered by arrogant humans, is completely walked back, despite Miyazaki's fears that it might alienate his readership and disrupt his plans for the series. Instead, purity becomes the enemy, an ideal held by the antagonistic Crypt Keeper who wants to cleanse the wasteland of pollution, including all its people, who have only been able to survive in this harsh land by becoming polluted themselves. Nausicaa tells us that no person can mature without embracing the darkness in the world, and those who see the world in black and white inevitably deny something inside themselves. By prioritizing our feelings over our intellect, unconscious nature over conscious artifice, we will become true simpletons, who never lose sight of that most fundamental emotional core that guides us through life, pushing us to grow. This reverence for growth that was established in the Nausicaa manga became the main philosophical underpinning for Miyazaki's most influential movies, including Totoro, Princess Mononoke, and Spirited Away, all movies where traditional environmentalism means little when compared to the amazing power of growth.